Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to introduce you to a man whose reputation makes Hannibal Lecter look like a disgruntled Yelp reviewer. We're talking about Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, or if you're feeling fancy, Vlad Dracula. Yes, that Dracula. The guy who inspired Bram Stoker to create the world's most famous vampire wasn't actually a blood-sucking night creature. But honestly, after you hear what he actually did, you might think being a vampire would have been a step up for his public image. This is the story of a medieval ruler who took tough on crime, to levels that would make modern dictators nervously loosen their collars. Now, here's the good news. Vlad was a patriot who defended his homeland against overwhelming odds, fought corruption with an iron fist, and refused to bow to the Ottoman Empire when everyone else was practically doing the limbo under Sultan Mehmed II's expectations. He's considered a national hero in Romania to this day, with statues and everything. The bad news? His preferred method of criminal justice was impalement, which is exactly as horrific as it sounds, except somehow worse when you learn the details. We're talking about a guy who looked at medieval punishment options like beheading, hanging, and burning at the stake and thought, you know what? Not creative enough. Not nearly enough screaming. If Vlad had a Yelp page, it would be 1 star with reviews like would not recommend and died here 0 stars. Let's set the stage, shall we? 15th century Eastern Europe was basically the geopolitical equivalent of being stuck in the middle seat on a 12-hour flight between 2 sumo wrestlers. On one side, you had the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic superpower that was steamrolling through the Balkans like a hot knife through butter made of terrified Christian kingdoms. On the other side, you had the Kingdom of Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, and various other Catholic powers who talked a big game about defending Christendom, but were often too busy fighting each other to actually help. And right smack in the middle of this medieval Thunderdome was Wallachia, a small principality in what's now southern Romania, trying desperately not to get crushed. Wallachia's main export was apparently princes who died horribly, because the turnover rate for rulers was faster than a fast food restaurant in a college town. The position of Wallachian prince was less of a job and more of a death sentence with administrative responsibilities. You weren't elected by the people or appointed by divine, right? So much as you murdered, bribed, or backstabbed your way to the throne, held it for maybe 3 to 5 years if you were lucky, then got murdered, bribed, or backstabbed by the next guy in line. It was like Game of Thrones, except everyone lived in wooden fortresses that smelled like livestock, and instead of dragons, you just had really angry Turks with really sharp swords knocking at your door every other Tuesday. Into this delightful neighborhood, Vlad III was born around 1431 in Sighisoara, Transylvania, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and tourist trap where you can buy vampire-themed shot glasses and probably some truly terrible garlic bread. His father was Vlad II Drakel, which translates to Vlad the Dragon, because he was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity against Ottoman expansion. The word Drakel also means devil in Romanian, which is just chef's kiss perfect for branding purposes. So when young Vlad started calling himself Dracula, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil, he was essentially going by Devil Jr., which is the most metal name a medieval prince could possibly have. Forget Louis the Pious or Charles the Bald. This guy chose a nickname that translated to spawn of Satan. Now, Vlad's childhood was about as stable as a 3-legged table on a ship in a hurricane. When he was around 11 years old, his father made a deal with the Ottoman Sultan that was basically the diplomatic equivalent of giving a loan shark your kidney as collateral. To secure Ottoman support for his throne, Vlad too sent his 2 younger sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, to the Ottoman court as hostages. This was common practice at the time, a sort of medieval insurance policy that said, "I'll behave because you're holding my kids." Imagine being dropped off at your enemy's house for an extended sleepover, where if your dad misbehaves, you're the one who gets the punishment. It was like a foreign exchange program designed by someone who really hated children and diplomatic relations in equal measure. Young Vlad spent roughly 6 years, from about 1442 to 1448, living in the Ottoman Empire, probably in Anatolia, getting what we might generously call an education in the arts of war, politics, and creative cruelty. The Ottomans taught him horsemanship, military tactics, and the Turkish language, but they also showed him exactly how a powerful empire maintained control through fear and strategic brutality. Think of it as attending the world's most disturbing boarding school, where instead of learning Latin and arithmetic, you learn how to psychologically destroy your enemies and the proper technique for displaying their corpses as a warning to others. His brother Radu, by contrast, apparently had a much better time, allegedly becoming a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II for reasons that medieval historians cough politely about before changing the subject. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, things were going spectacularly poorly for the Dracula family. In 1447, Vlad II was overthrown by rival nobles backed by Hungary, and both he and Vlad's older brother Mircea were killed in ways that medieval chronicles describe with the kind of detail that makes you wonder if the scribes enjoyed their jobs a little too much. Mircea was allegedly buried alive after being blinded, which is the kind of death that makes you think medieval people really needed better hobbies than inventing horrible ways to kill each other. So 13-year-old Vlad is sitting in Ottoman custody, getting news that his father and brother have been tortured and murdered by Hungarian-backed nobles, which is basically the origin story for every supervillain ever. This wasn't a "with great power comes great responsibility" moment. This was a "with great trauma comes great retaliation" moment. The Ottomans, seeing an opportunity to install a puppet ruler in Wallachia, backed Vlad's claim to the throne in 1448 when he was just 17 years old. This first reign lasted about as long as a mayfly's life expectancy, roughly 2 months, before he was chased out by the very same Hungarian-backed forces that had killed his family. Imagine getting your dream job, showing up on your first day, and being told 2 months later that actually they're going with someone else. Oh, and also everyone wants you dead now. But this brief taste of power was enough to give young Vlad a clear vision of his future career goals. Get the throne back, keep it, and make absolutely everyone who stood in his way regret they were ever born. It's the kind of focused ambition that would make a life coach proud and a therapist deeply concerned. Vlad spent the next few years in exile, which in medieval terms meant bouncing around various courts, trying to gather support, while avoiding assassination attempts like they were spam calls. He initially sought refuge in Moldavia with his uncle, then made nice with the Hungarians, specifically John Hunyadi, the very man who had backed his father's overthrow and death. This required the kind of pragmatic shamelessness that's either admirable or sociopathic, depending on your perspective. It's like getting your high school bully to write you a college recommendation letter, because he's now the dean of admissions. Politics in 15th century Eastern Europe wasn't about principles. It was about survival, and Vlad was learning to be a survivor with all the warm fuzziness of a great white shark in a feeding frenzy. By 1456, the pieces were finally falling into place for Vlad's comeback tour. John Hunyadi had died of plague after successfully defending Belgrade from an Ottoman siege, removing one of the major obstacles to Vlad's ambitions. The current Wallachian prince, Vladislav II, who had been occupying Vlad's throne for the past 8 years, had made the fatal mistake of still being alive and in Vlad's way. So in the summer of 1456, Vlad did what any ambitious medieval prince would do. He gathered an army, marched into Wallachia, killed Vladislav II in personal combat, and took the throne for the second time. Except this time, at age 25, Vlad wasn't planning on another 2-month trial period. This time, he was planning on staying, and God help anyone who thought otherwise, because Vlad certainly wasn't going to. His first order of business, as the newly reinstalled Prince of Wallachia, was dealing with the boyars, the noble class who had been playing musical chairs with the Wallachian throne for decades like it was some kind of murderous game show. These weren't your Disney-style nobles who wore fancy clothes and had pleasant tea parties. These were opportunistic power brokers who had assassinated, betrayed, and backstabbed their way through more princes than most people go through pairs of socks. The boyars had directly participated in killing Vlad's father and brother, and they'd spent years making Wallachia's political situation more unstable than a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Vlad looked at this situation and decided that forgiveness was for people who hadn't spent their teenage years as hostages learning advanced torture techniques from the Ottoman Empire's greatest hits collection. So on Easter Sunday in 1459, Vlad invited all the boyar families to a feast at his palace in Targovist, which should have been everyone's first red flag, because when has a medieval ruler inviting you to a surprise party ever ended well? After they'd eaten and drunk their fill, probably congratulating themselves on successfully brown-nosing the new prince, Vlad asked them a simple question. How many princes had they seen come and go? The older boyars proudly started counting off names, apparently not reading the room, which was rapidly filling with armed guards. Some claimed to remember 7 princes. Others boasted of 30 or more regime changes they'd personally witnessed. They were essentially admitting to being professional traitors, which is like confessing to crimes at your own trial while the judge is holding a sentencing guideline that starts at impalement and goes up from there. Vlad then did something that medieval chronicles record with the kind of gleeful horror that suggests the scribes were taking notes for their own revenge fantasies. He arrested all the older boyars and their families right there at the feast, which is why you should never RSVP yes to a party thrown by someone whose family you helped murder. The older nobles, the ones who had directly participated in killing his father and brother, were impaled on stakes right there in the palace courtyard, turning Easter Sunday into Easter Sunday of horror. The younger boyars and their families were force-marched 50 miles north to the ruins of a fortress called Poenary, high in the Carpathian Mountains, where they were put to work rebuilding it stone by stone. They worked in their fine Easter clothes until the garments literally rotted off their bodies, which is either poetic justice or deeply psychotic, depending on your perspective on labor law violations. The Poenary Castle project was Vlad's version of a corporate team-building retreat, except instead of trust falls and ropes courses, it was forced labor until you died of exhaustion on a mountain. The fortress was strategically located on a cliff overlooking the Argesh River, accessible only by climbing 1,480 steps carved in the mountainside, which is a workout that would make a stairmaster look like a gentle suggestion. Many of the boyar families died during the construction, but that was kind of the point because Vlad wasn't just building a fortress. He was eliminating an entire class of political opposition while simultaneously getting free construction labor. It's the kind of efficiency that would make a management consultant weep with joy and a human rights organization weep for entirely different reasons. By the time the fortress was finished, the old boyar class had been effectively destroyed, and Vlad had a sweet mountain hideaway for weekend getaways. With the traditional nobility decimated, Vlad replaced them with loyal supporters from lower classes, men who owed their position entirely to him and thus had zero incentive to plot his overthrow. This was actually pretty revolutionary for medieval politics, where power was usually hereditary and nobles thought they had a divine right to be corrupt, incompetent backstabbers. Vlad's new nobility understood that their fancy titles and land grants came with one simple condition: absolute loyalty or absolutely horrific death. It was essentially the world's most effective employee retention program, with a benefits package that included getting to keep your internal organs internal. This centralization of power made Wallachia more stable than it had been in generations, which proves that sometimes the path to political stability is paved with the impaled corpses of your enemies, though that's probably not a strategy they teach at Harvard Business School. But Vlad wasn't just focused on domestic policy. He had foreign relations to manage, and by manage, I mean terrify into submission. The Ottoman Empire expected Wallachia to pay an annual tribute of 10,000 ducats and 500 boys to be trained as janissaries, which was essentially a subscription service where you paid money and children to avoid being invaded. Sultan Mehmed II, who had recently conquered Constantinople and was feeling pretty good about his conqueror nickname, sent envoys to collect this tribute in 1459. Vlad received them politely, listened to their demands, and then asked them a question about why they didn't remove their turbans in his presence. When they explained it was their religious custom, Vlad reportedly said he wanted to strengthen their custom and had their turbans nailed to their heads, which is the diplomatic equivalent of responding to a polite email with "per my last email," except written in blood and screaming. This turban-nailing incident, whether it actually happened or was propaganda, set the tone for Vlad's relationship with the Ottoman Empire, which can best be described as aggressively suicidal. He wasn't just refusing to pay tribute. He was actively insulting the most powerful empire in the region in ways that suggested he either had nerves of steel or a death wish, possibly both. In 1461, Vlad launched a campaign against Ottoman positions south of the Danube, in what is now Bulgaria, conducting night raids and scorched earth tactics that killed somewhere between 20,000 to 30,000 people, according to his own letters, which he wrote to Hungarian allies with all the enthusiasm of someone sharing vacation photos, except the vacation was mass murder. He burned villages, destroyed crops, and impaled so many Ottoman soldiers and Bulgarian civilians that the forests looked like macabre art installations designed by someone who flunked out of therapy. Vlad's letters to his allies describing these campaigns read like someone who really wanted you to know how good he was at his job, and his job was creating landscapes of corpses. In one letter to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad proudly listed his body count: 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, without counting those whom we burned in homes or whose heads were not chopped off by our soldiers. That, without counting, is doing some seriously heavy lifting there, suggesting the actual death toll was much higher, and Vlad was writing this like a sales report where the product was death and business was booming. He was basically sending his resume to potential allies, and under special skills, he listed crimes against humanity with quantifiable metrics. Modern job seekers stress about whether to include their community college certificate on their CV. Vlad was including detailed body counts like they were quarterly earnings reports. The most infamous incident from this period was Vlad's raid on the town of Giurgiu in 1462, which he described in gleeful detail in his correspondence. He attacked at night, which was his signature move because apparently Vlad had watched too many ninja movies, except they hadn't been invented yet, so he was just naturally gifted at psychological warfare. After capturing the town, he rounded up all the Ottoman officials and supporters, along with anyone who looked at him funny, probably, and had them impaled. Then he sent a cart full of severed noses and ears to Matthias Corvinus in Hungary as proof of his military success, which is like sending your boss a PowerPoint presentation, except the PowerPoint is a wagon full of body parts, and the presentation is "Look how much I hate the Ottomans." You have to admire someone who manages to make human ears into a form of bureaucratic documentation, even if that admiration is mixed with profound horror and concern. But the piece de resistance of Vlad's anti-Ottoman campaign was yet to come, and it would cement his reputation as the man who took psychological warfare to levels that made Game of Thrones look like a Mr. Rogers episode. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople and crushed numerous rebellions, was not amused by this upstart Wallachian prince who kept killing his soldiers and sending body parts through the mail like some medieval serial killer with a flair for dramatic correspondence. The Sultan assembled a massive army, estimated at anywhere from 60,000 to 150,000 men, depending on which source you trust, and marched north to personally deal with Vlad. This was the medieval equivalent of the CEO showing up at your regional office because you've been sending increasingly unhinged emails to corporate, except the CEO has an army and you're outnumbered by a factor of at least 10 to 1. Vlad, facing an Ottoman army that outnumbered his forces by an order of magnitude, did what any reasonable person would do. He retreated and engaged in guerrilla warfare, poisoning wells, burning crops, and turning the Romanian countryside into an inhospitable wasteland where the only thing more numerous than the corpses were the stakes they were impaled on. He conducted constant night raids on the Ottoman camp, attacking under cover of darkness and vanishing before organized resistance could form, which meant the Ottoman army was sleep-deprived, paranoid, and increasingly convinced they were fighting some kind of demon rather than a human being. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad personally led a raid aimed at assassinating Mehmed II himself, penetrating deep into the Ottoman camp in what became known as the Night Attack. They didn't succeed in killing the Sultan, but they came terrifyingly close and the psychological impact of the Prince of Wallachia nearly murdering you in your own tent while surrounded by 100,000 soldiers is the kind of thing that keeps even conquering sultans up at night. But the real masterstroke, the moment that would define Vlad's legacy and give him his charming nickname, came when Mehmed II's army approached Targovist, Wallachia's capital, in June 1462. The Sultan and his forces had been marching through a countryside that looked like the set of a horror movie directed by someone who thought The Walking Dead needed more creativity in its kill scenes. They'd seen burned villages, poison wells, and enough impaled corpses to fill a mid-sized phone book, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found outside the capital. There, stretching for almost 2 miles and covering an area of roughly 3 square kilometers, was what became known as the Forest of the Impaled, a field containing approximately 20,000 impaled corpses in various stages of decomposition, arranged in concentric circles around the city like the world's most disturbing garden display. Picture this from the Ottoman perspective. You're a soldier in the most powerful army in the world. You've conquered cities and crushed rebellions across 3 continents. And you've seen plenty of battlefield carnage because that's basically your 9-to-5 job description. But then you crest a hill and see thousands upon thousands of stakes, each topped with a rotting human body, arranged in geometric patterns like someone was going for a landscaping achievement award in hell. The smell alone must have been indescribable, the kind of stench that makes you rethink your career choices and wonder if maybe your mother was right about becoming a merchant instead. Among the impaled were Ottoman soldiers, Bulgarian civilians, and Wallachian traders, all slowly rotting in the summer heat, their bodies covered in carrion birds that had probably decided this was their retirement plan because the buffet never closed. The chronicles record that even Mehmed II, a man who had literally conquered Constantinople at age 21 and had seen more than his share of wartime atrocities, was horrified and impressed in equal measure. According to contemporary accounts, the Sultan reportedly said that he could not hope to defeat a man who did such things, who understood psychological warfare better than anyone he'd ever faced. It's the medieval equivalent of a horror movie director walking out of a competitor's film saying, "Okay, you win. I'm done. I can't top that." Mehmed had impaled people himself. It was a common Ottoman punishment, but he'd never considered turning impalement into performance art on this scale. Vlad wasn't just killing his enemies. He was creating an immersive experience, a theatrical production titled Why You Should Never Invade Wallachia, with a runtime of however long it took you to die on a stake, which could be days. The psychological impact of the Forest of the Impaled was exactly what Vlad had calculated. The Ottoman army, despite vastly outnumbering the Wallachian forces, lost its nerve. Soldiers started deserting, morale collapsed faster than a house of cards in a wind tunnel, and disease began spreading through the camp because camping next to 20,000 rotting corpses turns out to be terrible for public health, shocking absolutely no one with basic knowledge of medieval hygiene. Mehmed II, recognizing that conquering Wallachia would cost more than it was worth, both in terms of soldiers and psychological therapy that wouldn't be invented for another 5 centuries, decided to withdraw. He left behind a portion of his army under the command of Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother, which must have made for some deeply uncomfortable family dynamics. "Hey bro, long time no see. I'm here to overthrow you with a Turkish army. Hope there's no hard feelings about the whole childhood hostage situation." Radu the Handsome, who got his nickname because apparently medieval chroniclers appreciated good cheekbones, even in their military reports, had stayed loyal to the Ottomans and had allegedly been the favorite companion of Mehmed II, with all the implications that medieval historians politely avoid elaborating on. Now he was being used as a puppet ruler to replace his psychotic older brother, which is either the ultimate betrayal or a reasonable career move, depending on whether you think family loyalty should extend to covering for someone who decorates the countryside with impaled corpses. Radu had the backing of the remaining Ottoman forces and, crucially, the support of many Wallachian boyars and merchants who had decided that Vlad's rule through terror management style was bad for business. Turns out that when your prince's idea of urban planning includes forests of the impaled, it negatively impacts tourism and trade, shocking the medieval Chamber of Commerce. Vlad found himself in an increasingly desperate position throughout late 1462. His army was exhausted from constant warfare, his treasury was depleted, and his allies were proving to be about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. He'd sent desperate letters to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, asking for military support and basically saying, "Hey, remember all those Turks I killed for you? How about some help here?" But Matthias was dealing with his own problems and wasn't particularly eager to jump into a war with the Ottoman Empire just because some Wallachian prince had decided to anger the most powerful Muslim ruler in the world. Medieval alliances were less friends forever and more friends until it becomes inconvenient or expensive, and supporting Vlad was looking increasingly like both. It's like expecting your friend to help you move when you've been picking fights with the entire neighborhood, and also you live on the fourth floor of a walk-up. By November 1462, Vlad's position had become untenable. Radu's forces, backed by Ottoman gold and the support of Wallachian nobles who had grown tired of living in constant fear of impalement, were closing in on Targovist. Vlad made a tactical retreat to his mountain fortress at Poenary, the same castle he'd built with the forced labor of boyar families who mostly died during construction, which must have felt like coming full circle in the most depressing way possible. From there, he made a last-ditch attempt to reach Hungary and secure support from Matthias Corvinus. It was a desperate move, the medieval equivalent of driving to your ex's house at 2 a.m. because you need a place to crash and all your other friends have blocked your number. Except your ex is a king, and you're wanted for crimes against humanity, or what would be crimes against humanity if the concept existed yet. When Vlad finally reached Matthias Corvinus in late 1462, he expected support, military aid, and maybe a warm meal, because he'd been living in the mountains eating whatever medieval people ate when they were on the run from an Ottoman-backed puppet ruler. Instead, Matthias had him arrested. The reasons for this arrest are disputed by historians, but the most likely explanation involves politics, money, and betrayal, which is basically the holy trinity of medieval backstabbing. Matthias had received funds from the Pope intended for crusading against the Ottomans, but instead of actually fighting the Turks, he pocketed the money and needed a scapegoat to explain why he hadn't launched any crusades lately. Vlad, conveniently, was right there, already had a reputation for extreme violence, and couldn't exactly defend himself because he was currently a prince without a principality. So Matthias forged some letters allegedly from Vlad to the Sultan, offering to betray Christianity, and used them as justification for the arrest. Vlad spent the next 12 to 14 years in Hungarian captivity, which was less rotting in a dungeon and more comfortable house arrest in Buda and then Pest, because medieval imprisonment for nobility was basically a downgrade from 5-star to 3-star accommodations. He couldn't leave, but he had servants, decent food, and presumably a lot of time to reflect on his life choices and wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd overdone it with the whole impalement thing. During this imprisonment, Vlad apparently converted from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism, married a Hungarian noblewoman who was related to the royal family, and had at least 2 sons. It's a remarkably normal period in a deeply abnormal life, like a serial killer taking a decade off to focus on his marriage and attend his kids' soccer games. The Hungarian court apparently thought he was reformed enough to allow him to marry into nobility, which suggests either they had very short memories or medieval standards for reformed were incredibly flexible. While Vlad was enjoying his extended vacation in Hungarian custody, Wallachia was going through rulers faster than a revolving door in a hurricane. Radu the Handsome ruled with Ottoman backing until he died in 1475, possibly of syphilis, which is about as ignominious an end as you can get for someone nicknamed the Handsome. After Radu's death, the Wallachian throne became a hot potato that nobody could hold for long, with various claimants backed by different factions fighting for control. The Ottomans wanted a compliant puppet, the Hungarians wanted a buffer state against Ottoman expansion, and the Wallachian boyars wanted whoever would let them go back to being corrupt and not impale them for it. Into this chaos, Matthias Corvinus apparently decided that maybe Vlad wasn't so bad after all, or at least that he was a known quantity of crazy versus the unknown variables currently making a mess of Wallachia. In 1476, Matthias released Vlad and backed his claim to the Wallachian throne for a third time, which is either a testament to Vlad's political skills or proof that medieval rulers had the memory retention of goldfish. Vlad returned to Wallachia with a Hungarian-backed army, defeated his rivals, and reclaimed his throne after 14 years of absence. You'd think he'd have learned some lessons during his imprisonment, maybe adopted a gentler approach to governance, perhaps tried ruling with love instead of fear for a change. But this is Vlad we're talking about, a man whose idea of conflict resolution was impale first, ask questions never. His third reign began in November 1476, and almost immediately he started doing what he did best, terrifying everyone within a 100-mile radius and reminding people why they'd been kind of relieved when he left in the first place. However, this third reign would be brief, even by Wallachian standards, where prince was less a job title and more a temporary condition before violent death. Vlad had been back on the throne for only about 2 months when he was killed in battle sometime in December 1476 or January 1477. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed because medieval record-keeping was about as reliable as a Wikipedia article with 0 citations. Some accounts say he was killed fighting the Ottomans in battle, going down in a blaze of glory like a warrior prince should. Other sources suggest he was assassinated by Wallachian boyars who had decided that actually they preferred rulers who didn't constantly threaten them with impalement. Still, other chronicles hint he might have been killed by his own men, possibly by accident in the chaos of battle, which would be a deeply anticlimactic end for someone whose life read like a horror novel written by someone on a serious amount of stimulants. The location of Vlad's body became a mystery worthy of a medieval detective novel, assuming detective novels existed and detectives did something other than torture confessions out of people. According to tradition, his corpse was taken to Snagov Monastery, an island monastery about 25 miles north of Bucharest, where he was supposedly buried near the altar in a place of honor befitting a defender of Christianity. Archaeological excavations in the 1930s found a grave in that location, but it was empty except for some animal bones, which either means Vlad's body was moved at some point or that someone had a really weird sense of humor about funeral arrangements. Another grave near the monastery entrance contained a headless corpse dressed in expensive purple silk with a ring bearing a dragon symbol, which could have been Vlad, except the beheading part raises questions because none of the death accounts mention decapitation unless the Ottomans got hold of his body and decided to add insult to fatal injury. The confusion about Vlad's burial reflects the confusion about his legacy, which has been twisted, rewritten, and reinvented more times than a Hollywood franchise that won't die. In the immediate aftermath of his death, stories about Vlad spread across Europe faster than plague through a medieval city, and with about as much accuracy as a game of telephone played by people who don't speak the same language. German pamphlets published in the late 1400s portrayed him as a psychotic tyrant whose favorite hobbies included impalement, torture, and dinner theater where the entertainment was watching people die in creative ways. These pamphlets were basically the medieval equivalent of tabloid journalism, full of lurid details that may or may not have been true, but were definitely entertaining enough to sell copies to a European public that apparently had a taste for horror stories about Eastern European princes who made Caligula look well-adjusted. One German pamphlet from 1488 featured a woodcut illustration of Vlad dining among a forest of impaled victims, casually eating his meal while surrounded by screaming, dying people like it was just another Tuesday afternoon. According to this account, when one of his boyars complained about the stench from the rotting corpses, Vlad had him impaled on an extra tall stake so he could be above the smell, which is either completely made up or proof that Vlad had a sense of humor darker than a coal mine at midnight. Other stories claimed he impaled a woman for having a lazy husband, nailed a merchant's hat to his head for not removing it quickly enough, and once invited all the poor and sick people in his realm to a feast, locked them in the hall, and burned the building down because he wanted to solve poverty in one efficient evening. These stories paint Vlad as less a medieval ruler and more a horror movie villain who somehow got elected to public office. But here's where it gets interesting, And by interesting, I mean complicated in ways that make history professors reach for their strongest coffee. Not all the contemporary accounts were negative. Byzantine and Russian sources from the same period portrayed Vlad as a strict but just ruler who defended Christianity against Ottoman aggression and punished crime with an iron fist wrapped in barbed wire dipped in acid. These sources acknowledged his cruelty but framed it as necessary severity rather than sadistic pleasure. One Russian manuscript called The Tale of Dracula portrayed him as a harsh but effective administrator who eliminated crime so completely that he could leave a golden cup by a public fountain and nobody would dare steal it, because the penalty was impalement, and everyone knew Vlad didn't make idle threats. It's the medieval version of the trains ran on time, except instead of trains, it was impalement stakes, and instead of running on time, they were always ready and waiting for criminals. The divergence in these accounts tells us more about the politics of storytelling than the actual historical Vlad. The German pamphlets were produced in territories that had political and economic rivalries with Hungary, and portraying Vlad as a monster served to undermine Hungarian interests in the region, because nobody wants to support the guy who backs psychotic impaling enthusiasts. The Byzantine and Russian sources, meanwhile, were from Orthodox Christian cultures that saw Vlad as a defender of the faith against Islamic expansion, willing to do whatever was necessary to protect Christian lands from Ottoman conquest. It's like reading restaurant reviews where half the reviewers say the chef is a genius and the other half say he's a menace to public health. And you're sitting there thinking, these can't possibly be describing the same restaurant, right? Except they absolutely are, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, probably closer to the menace end of the spectrum. What we can say with reasonable historical certainty is that Vlad did use impalement extensively as both punishment and psychological warfare, that he did kill thousands of people during his military campaigns, and that he was exceptionally brutal even by medieval standards, where brutal was basically the default setting. Medieval rulers were generally not known for their gentle touch. They were burning heretics, massacring conquered populations, and executing criminals in ways that would make modern audiences pass out. But even in this context of normalized violence, Vlad stood out. He didn't just use violence as a tool. He turned it into an art form, a theatrical performance designed to terrify enemies and subjects alike into absolute submission. If other medieval rulers were using violence as a hammer, Vlad was using it as a surgical instrument combined with a paintbrush and a megaphone to make sure everyone knew exactly what would happen if they crossed him. The irony is that Vlad's most lasting legacy has nothing to do with his actual historical accomplishments and everything to do with an Irish novelist who needed a good name for his vampire antagonist. In 1897, more than 400 years after Vlad's death, Bram Stoker published Dracula, a gothic horror novel that would become one of the most influential works of fiction ever written. Stoker had been researching Eastern European folklore for his vampire story when he came across references to Vlad Dracula, the Wallachian prince with a fearsome reputation and a name that sounded perfect for a supernatural monster. Stoker took the name, the Transylvanian setting, and some vague biographical details, threw in some vampire folklore, added a bunch of Victorian anxieties about sexuality and foreign invasion, and created Count Dracula, the vampire who would define the genre for over a century and counting. The hilarious part is that Stoker's Count Dracula has almost nothing in common with the historical Vlad beyond the name and general Eastern European location. The historical Vlad wasn't a vampire, wasn't immortal, didn't drink blood as far as we know, though the impalement thing does suggest some issues with blood, wasn't a charming aristocrat seducing English women, and didn't turn into a bat or fear garlic, unless we're missing some really interesting medieval chronicles. But Stoker's novel was so successful, spawning hundreds of adaptations, sequels, and imitators, that the name Dracula became synonymous with vampires in popular culture. Now, when most people hear Dracula, they think of a pale aristocrat in a cape who sleeps in a coffin and sparkles in some versions that we don't talk about, not a medieval Wallachian prince who impaled people as a hobby and side hustle and probably primary career focus. This confusion between the historical Vlad and the fictional Dracula has turned into Romania's most profitable accidental marketing campaign. Transylvania, where Vlad was born but never actually ruled, has become a major tourist destination for vampire enthusiasts who want to visit Dracula's castle and experience Gothic horror tourism. Bran Castle, a perfectly nice medieval fortress that is only the most tangential connection of Vlad. He might have passed through once, maybe if the accounts are accurate, has been marketed as Dracula's castle and attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists annually who are disappointed to learn there are no coffins or vampires. Just a regular castle with gift shops selling plastic fangs and bottles of wine with pictures of bats on them. It's genius marketing based on a complete historical misunderstanding. Like if people thought Abraham Lincoln was actually a vampire hunter and started visiting the Lincoln Memorial expecting to find stakes and crossbows. The Romanian government and tourism industry have leaned into this vampire association with the enthusiasm of someone who has discovered that international tourists will pay good money to visit places connected to fictional monsters. You can take Dracula-themed tours, stay in Dracula-themed hotels, eat at Dracula-themed restaurants where the menu items have names like blood soup, which is just borscht with a marketing degree, and buy Dracula merchandise that ranges from tasteful historical reproductions to plastic vampire teeth made in China. The historical Vlad, who was a Christian prince fighting against Muslim expansion and probably would have some thoughts about being associated with an undead creature of darkness, has been transformed into a brand. His legacy has been commodified, sanitized, and packaged for mass consumption by tourists who want a spooky vacation, but not too spooky because they still need Wi-Fi and air conditioning. Meanwhile, within Romania, Vlad occupies a much more complex cultural space that reflects the country's complicated relationship with its own history. He's considered a national hero by many Romanians, with statues in several cities and his image appearing on everything from currency to tourism posters. He represents resistance to foreign domination, strong leadership, and the defense of Romanian culture against overwhelming odds, which are exactly the qualities you want in a national hero if you can overlook the industrial-scale impalement. Romanian historians and politicians have worked to rehabilitate Vlad's image, emphasizing his role as a defender of Christianity and a unifier of Romanian lands while downplaying the whole, turned the countryside into a forest of impaled corpses aspect of his resume. It's historical revisionism with good intentions, trying to reclaim a complex historical figure from both the German propaganda that made him a monster and the vampire fiction that made him a supernatural seducer. But this heroic narrative requires some serious mental gymnastics and selective memory about what Vlad actually did, which was kill thousands of people in ways that made even his contemporaries uncomfortable. You can argue that he was a product of his time, that medieval warfare was brutal across the board, that he was defending his homeland against a powerful empire that would have conquered Wallachia without his extreme measures. All of that is true. You can also argue that even by medieval standards, he was exceptionally cruel, that many of his victims were innocent civilians, that impaling boyar families, including women and children for their ancestors' political choices, is objectively horrific regardless of historical context. That's also true. The historical Vlad exists in this uncomfortable space where he was both a defender of his people and a war criminal, both a skilled military leader and a man who committed atrocities that would violate every article of the Geneva Conventions if they had existed and if impalement needed its own specific prohibition. The modern Romanian attitude toward Vlad is basically, yes, he impaled a lot of people, but at least he impaled them for patriotic reasons, which is a fascinating approach to historical memory. It reflects a broader trend in nationalist historiography where questionable historical figures get rehabilitated because they represent resistance to foreign powers or embodied national virtues, even if those virtues came packaged with crimes against humanity. Every country does this to some extent, finding ways to celebrate their problematic historical figures by emphasizing their positive contributions and minimizing their atrocities. But Romania has the added challenge that their national hero's main claim to fame is a torture method so distinctive it became his nickname. It's like if America's founding father was named George Washington the Disemboweler, and we had to find ways to talk about his contributions to democracy without mentioning all the disemboweling. except we couldn't avoid mentioning it because it's literally in his name. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to cultural icon reveals something fascinating about how societies process and package their past for public consumption. In the 21st century, Vlad exists simultaneously as a national hero, a vampire, a symbol of resistance, a war criminal, a tourism brand, and a Halloween costume, which is more career diversity than most people achieve in a single lifetime, let alone 5 centuries after death. He's been featured in countless movies, TV shows, video games, and books, most of which have absolutely nothing to do with the historical reality and everything to do with whatever the creators needed for their particular story. In some versions, he's a tragic hero forced into cruelty by circumstances. In others, he's an absolute monster who deserves his fate. And in still others, he's actually a vampire, because why let historical accuracy get in the way of a good neck-biting scene? This cultural malleability tells us that Vlad has become less a person and more a mirror that reflects whatever anxieties, values, or entertainment needs the current moment requires. In the Cold War era, some Romanian historians portrayed him as a proto-communist revolutionary fighting against the feudal boyar class, which required ignoring that he replaced the old nobility with a new nobility that answered to him personally, making him more of an absolutist monarch than a people's champion. In the post-communist period, he's been rebranded as a nationalist hero defending European Christian civilization against Islamic expansion, which plays better with modern European anxieties about immigration and cultural identity, but conveniently forgets that he spent years as an Ottoman hostage, spoke fluent Turkish, and learned most of his military tactics from the very empire he later fought. The historical Vlad keeps getting costume changes to fit whatever narrative is currently popular, like a puppet who changes outfits, depending on who's pulling the strings. The academic study of Vlad is its own special kind of chaos because the primary sources are contradictory, often politically motivated, and sometimes outright fabrications designed to serve specific agendas. We have German pamphlets that portray him as a sadistic monster, Russian tales that present him as a harsh but just ruler, Ottoman chronicles that mention him as a troublesome opponent, Hungarian documents that are politically motivated in multiple directions, and Romanian sources that are defensive about their national reputation. Trying to extract historical truth from these sources is like trying to reconstruct a car accident when all the witnesses hate each other and have reasons to lie. Historians have spent careers trying to figure out what Vlad actually did versus what people said he did versus what people wanted you to think he did. And the consensus is basically he definitely impaled a lot of people. The exact number is debatable. Some of the crazier stories are probably false. But honestly, he was still pretty terrible. One of the more darkly amusing aspects of Vlad scholarship is the ongoing debate about whether specific atrocities attributed to him are true or propaganda. Historians will write entire papers arguing about whether he really impaled 20,000 people outside Targovist, or if it was only 10,000, as if having the body count somehow makes it better, like haggling at a farmer's market, except the produce is human corpses and nobody wins this negotiation. They debate whether he actually dined among impaled victims, or if that was German propaganda, whether he burned those poor and sick people alive, or if that story was invented to make him look bad, whether he impaled that boyar on a tall stake for complaining about the smell, or if that anecdote is too perfect to be true. The underlying assumption in all these debates is that some level of mass murder and impalement is historically confirmed and acceptable for discussion. We're just quibbling about the details and specific body count. The medical and forensic aspects of Vlad's preferred execution method add another layer of horror that modern audiences might not fully appreciate because we're fortunately far removed from the practicalities of medieval torture. Impalement, when done the way Vlad allegedly preferred, was designed to maximize suffering while delaying death for as long as possible. The stake was carefully rounded and oiled to avoid immediate fatal injury, inserted through the body in ways that avoided major organs and blood vessels, then erected vertically so gravity would slowly force the victim down the stake over hours or days. It's the kind of execution method that requires technical expertise and careful planning, suggesting Vlad didn't just order impalements casually, but had trained personnel who knew exactly how to make the process as prolonged and agonizing as possible. He had impalement specialists on his payroll, which is a job title that doesn't appear on LinkedIn, but probably should for historical accuracy. From a psychological perspective, Vlad represents a fascinating case study in how trauma shapes personality and leadership style, assuming we can diagnose someone who's been dead for 5.5 centuries based on politically motivated chronicles and German propaganda. He experienced profound childhood trauma, his father's murder, his brother's torture and death, years as a hostage in a foreign empire where he learned that power comes from the ability to inspire absolute terror. He lived in a political environment where betrayal was constant, where allies could become enemies overnight, where the average lifespan of a Wallachian prince was shorter than a mayfly's if the mayfly was particularly unlucky. In this context, his extreme cruelty could be understood not as sadism for its own sake, but as a calculated strategy to prevent the kind of betrayals that had destroyed his family. Of course, this psychological analysis doesn't excuse impaling thousands of people, but it might explain why he thought it was a good management strategy when therapy and conflict resolution workshops weren't available options. The comparison between Vlad's methods and modern authoritarian tactics is uncomfortably relevant, because while the technology and public relations strategies have evolved, the basic playbook of ruling through fear remains depressingly similar. Vlad used impaled corpses as a deterrent. Modern authoritarians use disappeared dissidents and show trials. Vlad displayed his victims publicly to send a message. Modern regimes use state media and controlled information to shape narratives. Vlad eliminated the traditional power structure and replaced it with loyalists. Modern dictators purge institutions and install cronies. The scale and methods have changed. We've mostly moved past impalement as a standard government practice. Mostly, but the underlying strategy of maintaining power through fear and the elimination of opposition has shown remarkable durability across centuries. Vlad would probably be disappointed by how boring modern authoritarianism is, where instead of forests of impaled corpses, you just have suspicious falls from windows and poisoned tea, which lack the dramatic flair of medieval psychological warfare. The environmental impact of Vlad's reign is something historians rarely discuss, but is worth considering because turning the countryside into a charnel house full of rotting corpses has ecological consequences. The forests of impaled bodies would have attracted massive populations of carrion birds, scavengers, and insects, fundamentally altering local ecosystems in ways that probably lasted years after the bodies were removed or decomposed. Water sources would have been contaminated by decomposition runoff, which is great if you're trying to spread disease among invading armies, but less great if you're a peasant who needs to drink from that river. The scorched earth tactics Vlad employed against the Ottomans, burning crops and villages across huge swathes of territory, would have created famine conditions and long-term agricultural disruption. Vlad's military strategy was basically ecological warfare before the concept existed, turning the Romanian countryside into an uninhabitable hellscape where the primary crop was human suffering and the wildlife consisted mainly of birds that had developed a taste for human flesh. The gender dynamics in Vlad's story are also worth examining because medieval chronicles mention female victims but largely focus on male political and military actors, which reflects both historical reality and historiographical bias. Women certainly suffered under Vlad's rule. The boyar families he had impaled or worked to death at Poenary included wives and daughters, and civilian casualties in his campaigns would have included women and children. But the sources focus overwhelmingly on his conflicts with male nobles, male soldiers, and male rulers, treating women mainly as collateral damage rather than political actors in their own right. The exception is Vlad's wives, who appear briefly in the chronicles. His first wife, whose name isn't even recorded, allegedly committed suicide by jumping from Poenary Castle when the Ottomans approached, which if true suggests that death was preferable to whatever she thought would happen if she was captured, painting a grim picture of what life with Vlad was like even for his closest companions. The economic impact of Vlad's reign on Wallachia was catastrophic in the short term, but possibly beneficial in the long term, depending on whether you value economic stability over human life, which hopefully you don't, or we need to have a different conversation. His elimination of the boyar class and centralization of power did reduce the constant civil wars and succession crises that had plagued Wallachia for decades, creating a more stable political environment that was theoretically better for trade and economic development. The fact that this stability was achieved through mass murder and rule by terror somewhat undercuts the economic benefits, like saying a home renovation really improved the property value while ignoring that you achieved it by burning down the neighbors' houses. His anti-corruption measures, which consisted primarily of impaling corrupt officials, were effective in the sense that corruption rates probably dropped dramatically when the penalty was being slowly killed on a stake, but this isn't a sustainable or ethically defensible approach to government reform. The religious dimension of Vlad's legacy adds another layer of complexity because he's been claimed by both Orthodox and Catholic traditions despite converting between them apparently for political convenience. Orthodox Christians in Romania and elsewhere have portrayed him as a defender of Orthodox Christianity against Ottoman Islamic expansion, conveniently overlooking his conversion to Catholicism during his Hungarian imprisonment. Catholics have pointed to his conversion and his role in defending Christendom's eastern frontier, glossing over the fact that he converted back to orthodoxy before his final reign and that his methods of defense included atrocities that violated pretty much every Christian teaching about the sanctity of human life. Both traditions want to claim him as a religious warrior, while neither wants to fully acknowledge that his actual relationship with Christian theology was probably less devoted believer and more useful political identity, depending on which patron he needed support from at any given moment. The legacy of Vlad's military tactics in Romanian and Eastern European military thinking is surprisingly significant considering his mixed success on the battlefield. While he ultimately failed to permanently drive back the Ottomans and died after ruling for only about 6 years total across 3 reigns, his use of guerrilla warfare, night attacks, scorched earth tactics, and psychological operations influenced later Romanian and Balkan resistance movements against Ottoman rule. Subsequent rulers and rebels studied his campaigns, sometimes learning what to do and sometimes learning what not to do, because martyring yourself and most of your population while only temporarily inconveniencing your enemies is not actually a winning long-term strategy. Modern Romanian military academies study his campaigns as examples of how a smaller force can resist a much larger power through unconventional tactics and willingness to endure tremendous suffering, which is technically correct, but leaves out the part where those tactics involve creating landscapes of corpses and ultimately didn't prevent Ottoman domination of the region for centuries. The intersection of Vlad's historical reality with vampire mythology reveals something interesting about how folklore evolves and attaches itself to historical figures who capture the popular imagination. There were no vampire stories about Vlad during his lifetime or for centuries after his death. Romanian vampire folklore existed, but wasn't specifically connected to him until Bram Stoker made that association in the 1890s. Once Stoker published Dracula, the vampire mythology began flowing backward, contaminating historical understanding of Vlad with supernatural elements that had nothing to do with the actual man. Now tourists visit Romania expecting Gothic castles and vampire lore, while the real history of a medieval warlord who impaled people gets obscured by capes and fangs. It's like if future generations remembered George Washington primarily as a cherry tree murderer based on a fictional story. Except in this case, the fictional story is more entertaining and less ethically complicated than the reality, so everyone just goes with it. The medical understanding of what impalement actually does to the human body makes Vlad's choice of execution method even more disturbing when you consider it from a modern forensic perspective. The process would cause massive internal trauma, organ damage, hemorrhaging, shock, and eventually death from blood loss, infection, or organ failure. But the timeline could stretch from hours to days depending on the skill of the executioner and the placement of the stake. Victims would remain conscious through much of the ordeal, experiencing unimaginable pain while slowly dying in public view as a warning to others. From a modern medical ethics standpoint, it's torture combined with execution in the most prolonged way possible, designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve a quick death. The fact that Vlad apparently had this done to thousands of people, not as occasional punishment, but as routine policy, suggests either complete lack of empathy or a calculated decision that the deterrent effect was worth the moral cost, neither of which makes him look good in retrospect. The logistics of executing people on this scale raise practical questions that historians rarely address because they're too busy debating whether it was 20,000 or 10,000 victims to ask how you actually impale that many people in a reasonable time frame. You'd need teams of executioners working in shifts, a supply chain for stakes that requires cutting down entire forests and shaping thousands of wooden poles, transportation logistics to move victims and materials to execution sites, and disposal plans for thousands of rotting corpses once they finally died. It's industrial-scale execution that requires planning, resources, and personnel, suggesting Vlad had an entire bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to mass murder. Somewhere in Wallachia, there was probably a guy whose job title was essentially impalement coordinator, responsible for scheduling executions, maintaining stake inventory, and training new executioners in proper technique. It's the banality of evil centuries before Hannah Arendt coined the term, the mundane administrative work that makes atrocities possible. The psychological impact on the executioners themselves is another aspect that gets overlooked in the historical chronicles because medieval writers weren't particularly concerned with the mental health of the people implementing torture. But repeatedly executing people in such brutal fashion would have profound psychological effects on the executioners, either desensitizing them completely to human suffering or causing significant trauma, possibly both simultaneously. You can't spend your workday impaling people and then go home to a normal family dinner without some serious compartmentalization, unless medieval people were fundamentally different from modern humans in their capacity for processing violence, which seems unlikely. Vlad's regime would have created a whole class of people whose job was inflicting prolonged death, and those people would have had to live with that identity and those memories, which is its own kind of horror separate from the victim's suffering. The comparison between Vlad's Wallachia and other contemporary states reveals that while medieval Europe was generally violent, Vlad's approach was extreme even by the standards of an era that considered public execution entertainment and torture a legitimate judicial tool. France had its own brutal justice system. England was executing people for minor theft. The Spanish Inquisition was torturing heretics, and the Ottoman Empire employed impalement among other creative punishments. But even in this context of normalized violence, Vlad stood out for the scale, enthusiasm, and psychological sophistication of his cruelty. Other rulers used violence as a tool. Vlad used it as a language, communicating messages about power, control, and consequences through carefully staged displays of suffering. He was essentially a performance artist whose medium was human bodies and whose message was "don't mess with Wallachia," which is effective marketing, but probably not the legacy most people aspire to. The impact of Vlad's reign on Wallachia's long-term political development is debatable because historians love nothing more than arguing about counterfactuals that can never be proven. Some argue that his centralization of power and elimination of the boyar class created foundations for stronger state institutions, even if those foundations were built on mass graves. Others contend that his brutality poisoned Wallachia's political culture, establishing precedents for authoritarian rule that made democratic development more difficult centuries later. Both arguments require speculating about alternate histories where Vlad didn't impale everyone, which is like arguing about how different your life would be if your parents had made different choices. Interesting as a thought experiment, but ultimately impossible to verify. What we can say is that Wallachia remained politically unstable for centuries after Vlad's death, eventually becoming part of the Ottoman sphere of influence. Then the Austrian Empire, then Romania, suggesting his reign didn't exactly solve the region's fundamental political problems. The role of disease in Vlad's campaigns deserves more attention because medieval warfare killed more people through disease than combat, and Vlad's tactics would have been epidemiological nightmares. Poisoning wells, leaving thousands of rotting corpses exposed to the elements, destroying food supplies, and causing famine. All of these create perfect conditions for plague, dysentery, typhus, and other diseases that spread through armies and civilian populations alike. The Ottoman army that retreated after seeing the forest of the impaled was probably as much driven away by disease spreading through their camp as by psychological horror, because camping next to 20,000 decomposing bodies is a public health disaster waiting to happen. Vlad's military strategy was basically biological warfare before germ theory existed, using disease as a weapon without fully understanding the mechanisms, but definitely understanding the results. It's environmentally catastrophic, but militarily effective, assuming you don't care about the long-term health consequences for your own population, which Vlad apparently didn't. The literary and artistic representations of Vlad over the centuries form their own fascinating study in how cultural narratives evolve independently from historical reality. The German woodcuts from the 1480s portrayed him as a mustachioed tyrant dining among impaled victims, establishing visual tropes that would persist for centuries. Russian manuscripts presented him as a stern but just ruler, more Old Testament prophet than sadistic monster. Modern depictions range from tragic anti-hero to absolute monster to misunderstood patriot to sexy vampire, depending entirely on what the creator needs for their particular narrative. The real Vlad has disappeared under layers of interpretation, reinterpretation, and outright invention, until the historical figure is almost irrelevant compared to the cultural construction. He's become a Rorschach test, where what you see says more about you and your culture's values than about the actual 15th century Wallachian prince who's been dead for 5.5 centuries and has no say in how he's remembered. The educational challenge of teaching about Vlad in Romanian schools reveals the tension between national pride and historical accuracy, because you can't exactly tell children our national hero's signature move was impaling thousands of people without some careful framing. Romanian textbooks emphasize his resistance to Ottoman expansion, his efforts to create a strong centralized state, and his defense of Christian Europe, while treating the impalement issue as either Ottoman propaganda or unfortunate but necessary actions in defense of the realm. It's historical education with a strong editorial perspective, like teaching about Thomas Jefferson while downplaying the slavery issue, or Churchill while minimizing the Bengal famine, focusing on the aspects that support national identity while carefully contextualizing the problematic parts. Every country does this to some extent, but Romania has the particular challenge that their national hero's defining characteristic is a torture method, which requires some serious educational gymnastics to present in an age-appropriate way. The archaeological evidence from Vlad's reign is frustratingly limited because medieval Wallachia wasn't exactly keeping detailed records or preserving crime scenes for future forensic analysis. We have the ruins of fortresses he built or rebuilt, including Poenary Castle perched on its mountain cliff. But physical evidence of mass executions is scarce because bodies decompose, stakes rot, and 5 centuries of subsequent history has overlaid everything with new layers of development and environmental change. The empty grave at Snaga Monastery that might or might not have held Vlad's body is probably the most famous archaeological mystery. But even if we found definitive proof of where he was buried, it wouldn't tell us much about the historical reality of his reign. Archaeology is great at revealing information about daily life, trade patterns, and material culture, but it's not particularly good at documenting state-sponsored terror, which leaves historians relying on those biased, contradictory written sources we started with. The diplomatic history of Vlad's reign shows someone who was surprisingly sophisticated in international relations despite his reputation for barbaric cruelty, suggesting he understood that different situations required different approaches. He corresponded with the Pope, seeking support against the Ottomans and positioning himself as a defender of Christianity, using the kind of diplomatic language that wouldn't be out of place in a modern UN petition. He negotiated with Hungarian rulers, made and broke alliances, and understood how to leverage Wallachhia's strategic position between competing powers. The same man who was impaling thousands of people was also writing carefully crafted diplomatic letters, which creates cognitive dissonance until you remember that most successful medieval rulers combined political sophistication with extreme violence. They just usually weren't quite as enthusiastic about the violence part. Vlad's diplomatic correspondence reads like it was written by a reasonable statesman. His military actions read like they were directed by a horror movie villain. Somehow both are true simultaneously. The question of whether Vlad was mentally ill by modern psychiatric standards is impossible to answer definitively, but irresistible to speculate about, even though diagnosing historical figures is methodologically questionable at best. Was he a psychopath who lacked empathy and derived pleasure from others' suffering? Was he suffering from PTSD and other trauma-related conditions stemming from his childhood experiences? Was he simply a product of his violent time, doing what he thought necessary to survive and maintain power in a brutal political environment? Modern psychiatrists who've analyzed the historical accounts offer different diagnoses: antisocial personality disorder, sadism, or simply extreme Machiavellianism unconstrained by modern moral norms. The problem is that all these diagnoses are based on incomplete historical sources written by people with political agendas, which is like trying to diagnose someone based on their ex's social media posts. You're probably going to get a distorted picture regardless of the clinical accuracy of your diagnostic framework. The economic cost of Vlad's campaigns to the Wallachhian population rarely gets calculated because medieval economics is already difficult to reconstruct, and calculating the cost of constant warfare, mass executions, and scorched earth tactics is nearly impossible with limited data. But we can make educated guesses. Agricultural production would have been devastated by the destruction of crops and the death or displacement of farming populations. Trade would have been disrupted by the constant warfare and the fact that merchants prefer not to travel through regions where they might get impaled for accidentally insulting the prince. Tax revenue would have been reduced by the smaller population and decreased economic activity, creating a vicious cycle where the state needed more resources to fight wars, but had fewer resources available. The boyar estates that had been the economic backbone of Wallachia were disrupted or destroyed, with their owners impaled and their lands redistributed. It's economic devastation that would take generations to recover from, all in service of a military strategy that ultimately failed to permanently secure Wallachian independence from Ottoman influence. The psychological warfare aspect of Vlad's tactics was arguably more effective than the military results, which is saying something considering he managed to make the Ottoman Sultan retreat despite being outnumbered 10-1. The Forest of the Impaled wasn't just about killing 20,000 people. It was about creating a monument to suffering so horrific that it broke the will of one of history's most successful military forces. Modern militaries study psychological operations as force multipliers, but they do it with propaganda, information warfare, and targeted messaging, not by creating architectural installations made of rotting corpses. Vlad understood instinctively that fear could be as effective as actual military strength, that a reputation for extreme cruelty could make enemies hesitate, allies comply, and subjects obey without requiring constant physical enforcement. It's brilliant in a deeply disturbing way, like appreciating the technical skill of a serial killer's methodology while being horrified by the outcome. You can acknowledge the strategic intelligence while also recognizing it was deployed in service of atrocities. The long-term effects on Romanian national identity of having Vlad as a cultural hero reveal interesting tensions between nationalism, history, and morality. Every nation selectively remembers its past, emphasizing the heroic moments and downplaying the shameful ones. But Romania faces the particular challenge that their most internationally famous historical figure is known either as a vampire or as someone whose nickname references a torture method. This creates a defensive posture where Romanian historians and cultural commentators feel compelled to rehabilitate Vlad's image against both the vampire mythology and the tyrant narrative from Western sources. The argument becomes he wasn't that bad compared to other medieval rulers, or the cruelty was necessary given the political situation, which are technically defensible positions but require accepting a sliding scale of atrocity where mass murder becomes acceptable if sufficiently contextualized. It's uncomfortable but probably inevitable when national identity gets tied to historical figures who predate modern human rights concepts. The gender politics in vampire mythology's adoption of Vlad is worth examining because Bram Stoker's Dracula transformed a medieval warlord into a sexualized aristocratic predator, fundamentally changing the nature of the threat he represented. Historical Vlad threatened people with death through impalement. Fictional Dracula threatens women specifically with seduction, corruption, and transformation into something inhuman. This transformation reflects Victorian anxieties about female sexuality and foreign influence, using Eastern European exoticism as a container for cultural fears that had nothing to do with the historical Wallachian prince. The irony is that this sexualized vampire version became more culturally influential than the historical reality, spawning countless adaptations where Dracula is a romantic figure, a tragic antihero, or even a sparkling teen heartthrob. Each iteration moving further from the guy who actually just impaled people without any of the sexy supernatural elements. Vlad went from medieval warlord to ultimate bad boy through no choice of his own, purely because an Irish novelist needed a good name. The question of whether Vlad was actually effective as a ruler gets obscured by the focus on his cruelty, but it's worth examining separately because he could be both a monster and competent administrator simultaneously, as history has repeatedly demonstrated. By the metric of keeping Wallachia independent from Ottoman control, he failed. The principality became an Ottoman vassal state shortly after his death and remained so for centuries. By the metric of eliminating political opposition and centralizing power, he succeeded spectacularly, if temporarily, through methods that ensured nobody would challenge him without serious reconsideration of their life choices. By the metric of improving the lives of ordinary Wallachians, the evidence is mixed. Eliminating boyar oppression was probably popular, but constant warfare, mass executions, and economic devastation weren't exactly quality of life improvements. He's like a CEO who achieves short-term results through methods that destroy the company's long-term viability and employee morale, except instead of layoffs and restructuring, it's impalement and terror. The influence of Vlad's story on the entire vampire genre cannot be overstated, even though that influence is based almost entirely on a name and a vague association rather than actual biographical details. Without Stoker's decision to name his vampire Dracula and set part of the novel in Transylvania, vampire fiction might have developed completely differently, focusing on other folklore traditions or creating entirely original mythology. Instead, Vlad's name became inseparably linked with vampires, creating a feedback loop where vampire fiction influences popular understanding of historical Vlad, which then influences how Romania markets itself to tourists, which influences new vampire fiction, and so on. It's the most successful branding exercise in history, achieved entirely accidentally, 5 centuries after the brand's namesake died. Marketing professionals would kill for that kind of lasting impact, though hopefully metaphorically rather than through impalement. The environmental recovery of the regions Vlad devastated probably took decades, though we lack detailed ecological records from medieval Wallachia for obvious reasons. Forests that were cut down for stakes would need generations to regrow. Agricultural land that was scorched would need years to recover fertility. Water sources contaminated by decomposition would eventually be filtered naturally. But medieval people didn't understand water purification and probably continued using contaminated sources, perpetuating disease. Wildlife populations disrupted by the sudden abundance of carrion and human activity would need time to rebalance. The ecological legacy of Vlad's reign was probably visible in the landscape for decades after his death, though eventually nature covered the scars as it always does, which is both comforting and disturbing because it suggests that even the worst human atrocities are temporary from the planet's perspective, just unpleasant blips in geological time that mean everything to the people suffering through them, but nothing to the trees that eventually grow over the mass graves. The role of alcohol in Vlad's court and military campaigns is something that never gets discussed, but was probably significant because medieval people drank alcohol constantly, water being frequently unsafe and alcohol being both safer and more pleasant. Executing people while sober seems difficult from a psychological perspective. Executing them while drunk seems more plausible, which raises questions about whether Vlad's executioners were provided with alcohol as part of their compensation package to make their jobs more bearable. Medieval feasts involved copious drinking, and Vlad's infamous Easter feast, where he arrested all the boyars, would have included substantial alcohol consumption, which adds another layer to that event, because arresting drunk nobles is probably easier than arresting sober ones who might see it coming. The legendary incident of Vlad dining among impaled victims, if it actually happened, probably involved wine, because dining without alcohol wasn't really a medieval thing. None of this excuses anything, but it does add context to how medieval people managed to commit and witness atrocities that would traumatize modern observers. The succession crisis after Vlad's death demonstrates that eliminating all your political opposition through mass murder doesn't actually solve succession problems. It just creates a power vacuum that invites new conflicts. Without established boyar families to provide continuity or support legitimate succession, Wallachia descended into the same pattern of instability that had plagued it before Vlad's reign. His sons had claims to the throne, but lacked the power base to maintain them. Rival claimants backed by different foreign powers fought for control, and the principality remained politically fragmented until eventually accepting Ottoman suzerainty as the least bad option. Vlad's reign proved that you can't create lasting political stability purely through terror. Once the source of terror is gone, the fear dissipates and the underlying conflicts reassert themselves. It's a lesson about power that authoritarians keep learning and forgetting. That fear-based rule is inherently unstable because it requires constant reinforcement and collapses quickly when the enforcer disappears. The medical knowledge required to perform impalement correctly suggests that Vlad's executioners had practical anatomical understanding, probably gained through experience, about where stakes could be placed to avoid immediate death while ensuring eventual fatality. This is pre-scientific medical knowledge acquired through repeated practice of a torture technique, which is deeply disturbing when you think about it. Someone had to train these executioners, passing down knowledge about human anatomy discovered through trial and error while killing people. There was probably an institutional knowledge base about the best practices for impalement, informal training programs, and possibly even manuals or oral traditions describing proper technique. It's the professionalization of atrocity, the bureaucratization of cruelty, where torture becomes a skilled trade with apprenticeships and expertise levels. Medieval guilds existed for every profession. Presumably Vlad's executioners had their own informal guild, though they probably didn't march in civic parades or have a guild hall with their sigil displayed proudly. The comparison between Vlad's impalement and other medieval execution methods reveals that while execution was universally brutal in this period, there was still a hierarchy of cruelty that cultures recognized. Hanging was common and relatively quick if done properly. Beheading was considered honorable for nobility. Burning was horrific but associated with heresy and witchcraft. Drawing and quartering was extreme and reserved for treason. Impalement was known, but relatively rare outside of Ottoman practice. Recognized as particularly cruel even in an era that accepted cruelty as normal. Vlad's adoption and extensive use of this method suggests either that he learned it during his Ottoman captivity and brought it back as a cultural import, or that he independently concluded it was the most effective deterrent available. Either way, his scale of implementation was unique. Other rulers impaled dozens. Vlad impaled thousands. It's the difference between owning a gun and owning an arsenal, between occasional violence and systematic terror as state policy. The failure of neighboring Christian kingdoms to support Vlad more consistently against the Ottomans reveals the reality of medieval geopolitics, where religious solidarity was less important than immediate political and economic interests. Hungary, Poland, and other Catholic powers talked about defending Christendom against Ottoman expansion, but rarely provided substantial aid to Wallachia, leaving Vlad to fight essentially alone despite his propaganda value as a Christian defender. This wasn't because they approved of his methods. Contemporary Christian rulers also used brutal tactics when convenient. It was because Wallachia was poor, strategically marginal except as a buffer state, and supporting Vlad meant potentially provoking Ottoman retaliation that would cost more than Wallachia was worth. The calculus was cynical but rational. Better to let Wallachia serve as a speed bump, slowing Ottoman expansion, than commit substantial resources to its defense. Vlad understood this, which probably informed his decision to make himself so terrifying that enemies might hesitate even without Allied support, a strategy that worked temporarily but failed to secure long-term independence. The linguistic legacy of Vlad is surprisingly minimal considering his cultural impact. He didn't leave writings beyond official correspondence, didn't commission chronicles of his reign that survived, and didn't create any lasting contributions to Romanian language or literature. His legacy is entirely about what he did, not what he said or wrote, which is unusual for historical figures who achieve his level of fame. Most famous historical rulers left speeches, writings, or at least quotable remarks. Vlad's most famous quotation is probably the apocryphal response about strengthening the custom of wearing turbans by nailing them to people's heads, which may not even be real. His silence in the historical record makes him a blank screen onto which others project meanings, contributing to his malleability as a cultural symbol. Without his own words to complicate the narrative, he can be hero or villain, patriot or psychopath, depending entirely on who's telling the story and what they need him to represent. The architectural legacy of Vlad's reign consists primarily of fortifications and defensive structures, which makes sense for someone whose entire rule was defined by conflict and the need to defend against overwhelming enemies. Poenary Castle remains his most famous architectural achievement, though calling it an achievement requires overlooking that it was built through forced labor that killed most of the workers. The castle's location on a mountain cliff made it nearly impregnable, accessible only by climbing over 1,000 steps carved into rock, which is brilliant defensive architecture and absolutely terrible for accessibility or convenience. Modern tourists who visit Poenary and climb those steps usually arrive exhausted and wondering why anyone would build a fortress somewhere so inconvenient, missing the point that inconvenience for visitors was exactly the goal, because uninvited visitors were usually armies trying to kill you. The castle served as Vlad's refuge during his retreat in 1462 and stands today as a ruin, partially collapsed, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, which seems appropriate for a structure built on suffering. The monetary system during Vlad's reign reveals another aspect of his governance, because medieval economies depended heavily on coinage, and controlling currency was essential for state power. Vlad minted coins bearing his image and titles, asserting his authority through the most basic economic transaction. He allegedly punished counterfeiters with impalement, which is definitely a deterrent, though probably overkill for economic crimes, creating a situation where making fake money carried the same penalty as treason. His anti-corruption measures extended to merchants whom he suspected of fraud or shortchanging customers, with punishments that ranged from impalement to forced swimming in icy rivers, depending apparently on his mood and the severity of the offense. This created an environment where economic crime rates probably plummeted because the risk-reward calculation was heavily skewed toward don't even think about it. It's effective governance through terror applied to commerce, ensuring honest business practices by making dishonesty literally fatal, which works but isn't exactly the foundation for a thriving market economy. The impact of Vlad's campaigns on Ottoman military thinking is difficult to trace, but potentially significant because the forest of the impaled and the night attack demonstrated vulnerabilities in Ottoman military organization that later commanders would need to address. The fact that numerically inferior force could penetrate deep into their camp and nearly assassinate the Sultan revealed security weaknesses that required correcting. The psychological impact of the impalement displays showed that Ottoman soldiers, despite their reputation for martial prowess, could be demoralized by sufficiently horrific displays of cruelty. Whether these lessons actually influenced Ottoman military reforms is debatable, but Mehmed II's retreat from Wallachia despite overwhelming military superiority was unusual enough that it must have generated some strategic analysis and possibly embarrassment in the Ottoman court. You don't march 100,000 soldiers into a minor principality, fail to conquer it because the local prince created a forest of corpses, and then just forget about the whole experience without some lessons learned discussions. The religious justification for Vlad's actions, both during his lifetime and in subsequent historical memory, reveals how easily Christianity's teachings about mercy and compassion get subordinated to political and military necessity. Vlad portrayed himself as a defender of Christianity against Islamic expansion, which allowed Orthodox and Catholic sources to rationalize his atrocities as unfortunate necessities in a holy war. The fact that most of his victims were actually Christians, Wallachian subjects, Bulgarian civilians, Saxon merchants, gets conveniently overlooked in this framing. He impaled Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and Muslims with apparent equal enthusiasm, suggesting his religious identity was more political convenience than theological conviction. But the narrative of Christian defender against Ottoman aggression was too useful for subsequent generations to abandon. So Vlad got retrofitted as a crusader despite his methods violating basically every Christian ethical principle. It's theological gymnastics worthy of Olympic medals, finding ways to square mass murder with religious devotion. The daily life of ordinary Wallachians during Vlad's reign is nearly impossible to reconstruct because chronicles focus on political and military events, not peasant experiences, but we can make educated guesses that paint a grim picture. If you were a peasant farmer, your life already involved backbreaking agricultural labor, high mortality rates, and vulnerability to disease, famine, and violence. That's just baseline medieval peasant existence. Add to that constant warfare, armies marching through your fields eating your crops, scorched earth tactics destroying your livelihood, and the ever-present threat that your prince might impale you for some real or imagined offense. The stories about Vlad leaving golden cups at public fountains that nobody would steal suggest either remarkable honesty or paralyzing fear, probably the latter. You'd go to work, pay your taxes, keep your head down, and pray you never attracted official attention, because official attention might mean ending up on a stake. It's existence under constant low-level terror, where the absence of active persecution feels like success. The medical care available to impalement victims, which is to say none, reflects both medieval medical limitations and the deliberate nature of impalement as prolonged execution. Medieval medicine couldn't have saved impalement victims even if anyone had wanted to help them, which they didn't because the whole point was dying slowly as a warning to others. Physicians of the era understood that the injuries were fatal but lacked antibiotics, surgical techniques, or pain management beyond alcohol and possibly opium-based remedies that weren't widely available. The best-case scenario for an impaled victim was losing consciousness quickly through shock or blood loss, which was essentially mercy by accident rather than design. The worst case was remaining conscious for hours or days while slowly dying, which was actually the intended outcome. From a modern emergency medicine perspective, impalement injuries are among the worst possible traumas, causing massive internal damage, hemorrhaging, and infection risk, requiring immediate surgery that has limited success rates even with modern technology. Medieval victims had no chance, which was exactly the point. The documentation of Vlad's atrocities by contemporary sources raises interesting questions about medieval information networks and propaganda warfare. The German pamphlets that spread stories about Vlad's cruelty throughout Western Europe in the 1480s and 1490s were some of the earliest examples of printing press technology being used for mass distribution of sensationalized content. Basically, the medieval equivalent of viral social media posts, except printed on paper and illustrated with woodcuts. These pamphlets served political purposes, discrediting Hungarian interests in the region and satisfying German merchants who had trading conflicts with Wallachia, but they also suggest genuine horror at Vlad's actions. You don't invent propaganda from nothing. You exaggerate and sensationalize real events. The fact that multiple independent sources from different cultures all mention impalement and extreme cruelty suggests the basic facts were accurate, even if specific incidents were embellished. Medieval people were used to violence, so for them to be shocked required something genuinely exceptional. The succession planning, or complete lack thereof, during Vlad's reign demonstrates either remarkable short-sightedness or deliberate indifference to what happened after his death. He had legitimate sons, but didn't establish them in positions of power, didn't create alliances to support their succession, and didn't build institutional structures that would outlast him. This suggests either that he was so focused on immediate survival and military campaigns that he couldn't think long-term, or that he genuinely didn't care what happened to Wallachia after he was gone, viewing his reign as personal mission rather than dynasty building. It's the political equivalent of living entirely in the present with no retirement planning. Except instead of running out of money in old age, your country collapses in a civil war immediately after your death. The contrast with contemporaries like Mem II, who carefully planned succession and built lasting institutions, is stark. Vlad was tactically brilliant, but strategically myopic, winning battles and losing the war for Wallachia's independence. The folklore that developed around Vlad in Romanian oral tradition before Bram Stoker is worth examining because it shows how his memory evolved in popular culture separate from vampire mythology. Romanian folk tales portrayed him as a harsh but just ruler who punished the wicked and protected the righteous, a sort of extreme Judge Dredd figure who delivered swift and terrible justice without corruption or favoritism. These stories served social functions, teaching moral lessons about honesty and obedience while providing nationalist pride in a leader who stood up to foreign powers. The folk tradition whitewashed the mass murder aspects or reframed them as punishment for specific crimes rather than systematic terror, creating a more palatable hero figure for popular consumption. This folk tradition explains why many Romanians were confused and defensive when Western vampire mythology appropriated Vlad's name, because their cultural memory emphasized different aspects of his legacy. It's like if your respected, if complicated ancestor suddenly became known internationally as a monster based on a novel written by someone who never visited your country. The impact of Vlad's childhood as an Ottoman hostage on his later brutality is probably significant, but impossible to quantify, falling into the realm of psychological speculation about someone who's been dead for 5 centuries. Spending formative years as a hostage, watching his brother Radu apparently thrive in captivity while receiving news of his father's and brother's murders, would create trauma and resentment that could manifest as extreme cruelty later. The fact that he learned military tactics and administrative techniques from the Ottomans, then used those lessons against them with added brutality, suggests he was a good student who graduated with honors and then tried to destroy the school. But attributing his actions entirely to childhood trauma risks, excusing the choices he made as an adult with agency and power. Plenty of people experience childhood trauma without growing up to impale thousands of people. So while trauma might explain part of Vlad's psychology, it doesn't excuse his actions. He made choices. Those choices had consequences for thousands of victims, and ultimately he's responsible regardless of his childhood experiences. The theological debates about whether Vlad's soul was damned or saved reveal medieval Christianity's flexibility in rationalizing violence committed by politically useful figures. If you take Christian theology seriously, impaling thousands of people, including innocent civilians, should probably result in damnation unless you repent, which there's no evidence Vlad did, because he kept impaling people until he died. But Orthodox and Catholic sources found ways to argue he might achieve salvation because he defended Christianity against Muslim expansion, died fighting for the faith, and possibly repented at some unrecorded moment before death. It's theological reasoning that starts with the desired conclusion, Vlad as Christian hero, and works backward to justify it, which is how religious reasoning often works when politics gets involved. Modern Christians who view Vlad as a saint or holy warrior require either remarkable compartmentalization or a very different understanding of Christian ethics than mainstream theology teaches, essentially arguing that mass murder is acceptable if done for sufficiently important political and religious reasons, which is a dangerous precedent that justified crusades, inquisitions, and religious wars throughout history. The environmental knowledge required for Vlad's scorched earth campaigns suggests sophisticated understanding of how to maximize damage to agricultural systems and make land uninhabitable. Knowing which crops to burn at which times to prevent regrowth, which water sources to poison, which forests to clear for stakes, all requires practical ecological knowledge that peasants possessed but rulers needed to systematically weaponize. Vlad's forces didn't just randomly destroy things. They deliberately targeted the resources an invading army would need, creating conditions where continuing the campaign would be logistically impossible. It's strategic environmental destruction that presages modern total war concepts, where enemy, civilian infrastructure becomes legitimate military targets. The Geneva Conventions would later prohibit many of these tactics, recognizing that targeting civilian food supplies and water sources constitutes war crimes. But medieval warfare had no such restrictions. Vlad's campaigns demonstrated that making your own territory uninhabitable could be a defensive strategy, though it's a strategy that works better for the ruler, who can retreat to mountain fortresses, than for the peasants who have to live in the devastated landscape afterward. The economic refugees created by Vlad's campaigns would have fled to neighboring territories, spreading stories about the horrors they'd witnessed and creating demographic shifts that affected the entire region. Moldavia, Transylvania, and other nearby regions would have absorbed these refugees, who brought with them not just traumatic memories, but also agricultural knowledge, craft skills, and cultural practices that they'd carried for Wallachia. These refugee populations would have formed diaspora communities telling stories about the prince who impaled people, contributing to Vlad's reputation spreading across Eastern Europe through word of mouth long before printed pamphlets reached Western audiences. The economic cost to neighboring regions of absorbing sudden population influxes would have been significant, creating strain on resources and potentially generating resentment toward Wallachian refugees who were essentially exporting the consequences of their prince's policies to communities that had nothing to do with the conflicts that created them. The artifacts and material culture from Vlad's reign that survive today are remarkably few considering his historical significance, which reflects both the poverty of medieval Wallachia and the destructive nature of subsequent centuries. We have some coins minted during his reign bearing his likeness, a few documents with his signature and seal, and ruins of fortifications he built or occupied. That's essentially it for physical evidence of his existence beyond the landscape features like castle ruins. There are no personal items confirmed to have belonged to him, no clothing or weapons or everyday objects that would make him feel like a real person rather than a legend. This scarcity of physical evidence contributes to his mythological status, because without material reality to anchor him, he can become whatever story needs him to be. Archaeologists dream of finding something substantial from his reign, maybe his actual grave with identifiable remains, which would allow forensic analysis that could tell us about his health, diet, injuries, and possibly even DNA analysis that could confirm relationships to claimed descendants. The intelligence networks Vlad must have maintained to effectively govern through terror and conduct military operations suggest sophisticated information gathering systems that left no historical trace, because medieval spies didn't document their activities for future historians. He needed informants in boyar households to detect plots, scouts to track Ottoman movements, agents in neighboring kingdoms to understand political developments, and presumably spies within the Ottoman Empire itself, given his accurate intelligence about Turkish military capabilities. Running these networks required resources, handlers, and complex coordination that represented a significant portion of state capacity. The fact that these networks left no documentary evidence suggests either that records were deliberately destroyed to protect sources and methods, or that the networks operated informally through personal relationships rather than bureaucratic structures. Either way, Vlad's ability to anticipate and counter threats implies information superiority that came from somewhere, meaning he invested in intelligence gathering even while impaling people, showing he understood that knowledge was as important as terror in maintaining power. The legal system under Vlad apparently functioned through a combination of codified rules and arbitrary terror, creating an environment where nobody really knew what was legal versus what would get them impaled. Some accounts suggest he had strict laws about honesty in commerce, fidelity in marriage, and corruption in administration, enforcing these laws through extreme punishments that ensured compliance. Other accounts suggest he impaled people on whims, for offenses ranging from lying to wearing the wrong clothes to simply annoying him. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. He likely had actual legal code for common offenses, but exercised arbitrary power when politically convenient, creating a system where ordinary people followed rules to avoid the predictable punishments while political actors faced unpredictable violence based on Vlad's strategic calculations. It's rule of law combined with rule of terror, where law governs daily transactions, but terror governs power relationships, which is actually pretty common in authoritarian systems across history and geography. The cultural exchange between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire during Vlad's time was more complex than the simple Christian versus Muslim narrative suggests, because borders were porous, trade continued even during hostilities, and cultural practices flowed in both directions regardless of military conflicts. Vlad spoke Turkish, understood Ottoman culture from his years as a hostage, and adopted military tactics from Turkish sources. Meanwhile, Wallachian merchants traded in Ottoman markets. Orthodox Christian communities existed within the Ottoman Empire, and diplomatic relations continued even while armies fought. The impalement technique itself was Ottoman in origin, meaning Vlad was using an enemy's method against them, which is either ironic or predictable depending on how you view cultural diffusion during warfare. The idea of hermetically sealed civilizations battling for existence is historically inaccurate. Reality was messier, with constant interaction, exchange, and borrowing even between supposed mortal enemies. Vlad and Mim, too, were products of similar political cultures despite representing different religions, which explains why they could understand each other's tactics, even while trying to kill each other. The role of literacy and education in Vlad's court is difficult to determine because we lack detailed records. But he clearly had access to educated advisors, scribes, and diplomats who could conduct correspondence in multiple languages and navigate complex international relations. His letters to Hungarian rulers and others demonstrate sophisticated diplomatic language, suggesting either that Vlad himself was reasonably educated or that he employed skilled writers who could translate his intentions into appropriate formal communication. Medieval rulers didn't need to be personally literate if they had competent bureaucrats, but effective governance required understanding what documents said and meant, so Vlad probably had functional literacy at minimum. His Ottoman education would have included some level of scholarly instruction beyond purely military training, though probably focused on practical skills rather than theoretical learning. The contrast between the sophistication of his diplomatic correspondence and the brutality of his actions suggests someone who could operate effectively in both realms, which is perhaps more disturbing than if he'd been simply an illiterate barbarian, because it means his cruelty was calculated rather than ignorant. The weather and climate during Vlad's campaigns affected military outcomes in ways that rarely get discussed, because medieval chronicles didn't include meteorological data, and historians focus on human decisions rather than environmental factors. But warfare in this era was deeply affected by seasons, weather, and climate conditions that shaped when campaigns could be launched, how long armies could remain in the field, and whether logistical support could be maintained. The night attack occurred in June, which was optimal campaigning season in the Balkans, while winter campaigns were nearly impossible given the mountainous terrain and lack of infrastructure for moving and supplying large forces. Vlad's scorched earth tactics would have been more effective in summer, when crops were growing, than in winter when there was less to destroy, but also more devastating to the civilian population who depended on those crops. The Ottoman retreat from Wallachia in 1462 was influenced by disease, but disease spreads more easily in hot weather when sanitation breaks down, and decomposing corpses create perfect conditions for epidemics. meaning climate and Vlad's tactics combined to create an environment where continuing the campaign became untenable. The musical traditions in Vlad's court are completely unknown, which is a shame because medieval courts typically featured musicians, and music reveals cultural values and emotional landscapes that written sources don't capture. Did Vlad enjoy music? What instruments were played? Were there songs about his victories or ballads about his cruelty? We have no idea because this information wasn't preserved, suggesting either that Wallachian musical traditions weren't documented or that the documentation didn't survive. Romanian folk music traditions include ballads about various historical figures and events, some possibly dating to medieval periods. But separating authentic medieval content from later editions is methodologically challenging. It's possible that songs about Vlad existed, but were suppressed or forgotten because celebrating a ruler known for impalement became politically awkward, or that oral traditions simply evolved over centuries until original content was unrecognizable. The silence about Vlad's aesthetic preferences and cultural patronage makes him feel less human, more like a violence-generating machine than a person who might have enjoyed music or art or literature beyond their political utility. The medical understanding of death that Vlad and his contemporaries possessed was fundamentally different from modern conceptions, shaped by religious beliefs about souls, afterlife, and divine judgment rather than biological processes and brain death. Medieval people understood that impaled victims would die eventually, but the timeline and mechanism were less important than the theological and social meanings of the death. The prolonged suffering of impalement victims was seen as punishment for sins or crimes rather than medical trauma requiring intervention, which is why nobody tried to help them. Modern medical ethics demands we relieve suffering even for dying patients. Medieval ethics accepted suffering as part of divine justice or earthly punishment. This isn't because medieval people were inherently crueler, though they were certainly more accustomed to violence, but because their worldview included assumptions about pain, death, and justice that differ fundamentally from modern secular humanist perspectives. Understanding Vlad requires understanding this medieval context, where death itself wasn't the worst possible outcome. Damnation was, and suffering in this life might affect salvation in the next. The textile and clothing industry in Wallachia during Vlad's reign must have existed to supply armies, courts, and populations with necessary garments, but we know almost nothing about it beyond the story of boyars working at poenery until their fine clothes rotted off their bodies, which if true suggests they were wearing expensive textiles made from materials like silk or fine wool that wouldn't survive manual labor and weather exposure. Common people wore rough textiles made from local materials like wool, linen, and possibly hemp, produced through household labor rather than specialized manufacturing. The contrast between boyar finery and peasant rags was probably stark, with clothing serving as visible marker of social status in ways that were legally enforced in some medieval societies. Whether Vlad cared about his own appearance or dressed, simply we don't know. But given his years in the Ottoman court where elaborate dress was important for social signaling, he probably understood the political importance of appearance, even if we lack descriptions of his actual clothing. The entertainment available to Vlad and his court beyond allegedly dining among impaled victims is unknown, which seems like an oversight in the chronicles, but reflects that medieval writers focused on politically significant events rather than daily life. Medieval nobles typically enjoyed hunting, which served both recreational and military training purposes, and Wallachia's forests and mountains would have provided excellent hunting grounds. Feasting was entertainment, with elaborate meals serving social and political functions rather than just nutrition. Did Vlad enjoy chess or other strategic games? Read or have books read to him? Watch performances by traveling entertainers? We have no idea, which makes it impossible to imagine him as a complete person with leisure activities and preferences beyond military strategy and political violence. The lack of this humanizing information might be deliberate, making it easier to remember him as either monster or hero rather than a complex human being who presumably did something other than plot campaigns and order executions during his entire reign. The diplomatic protocols and court ceremonies in Vlad's Wallachia would have followed Byzantine Orthodox traditions mixed with local customs and possibly Ottoman influences, creating a hybrid culture that reflected the principality's position between competing civilizations. Receiving foreign ambassadors required specific rituals that communicated power relationships and respect, which is where the turban nailing incident allegedly occurred, suggesting Vlad either violated diplomatic protocols deliberately as an insult or had his own interpretation of proper conduct that didn't match Ottoman expectations. Medieval diplomatic culture was highly formalized, with specific gestures, language, and ceremonies that conveyed meaning to initiated participants. So violations weren't just rude, but potentially interpreted as declarations of hostility. The fact that Vlad successfully conducted diplomacy with multiple powers despite his reputation for violence suggests he could follow protocols when convenient and violate them when making a point, showing social sophistication rather than barbarism, which again is somehow more disturbing because it means his cruelty was chosen rather than compelled by ignorance. The agricultural calendar in medieval Wallachia dictated the rhythm of life, warfare, and even execution schedules in ways that modern urban people struggle to comprehend. Spring planting, summer growing season, autumn harvest, and winter survival created natural cycles that even princes who impaled people had to respect because armies, courts, and cities all depended on agricultural surplus for survival. Vlad's military campaigns typically occurred during summer months when roads were passable, armies could forage from the countryside, and peasant soldiers could be temporarily pulled from fields without causing complete agricultural collapse. Winter was for consolidation, planning, and survival rather than offensive operations, which meant the pace of violence followed seasonal patterns. Mass executions probably peaked during periods when labor demands were lower and when displaying corpses would have maximum psychological impact on audiences who weren't busy harvesting crops. It's the bureaucratization of terror synchronized with agricultural rhythms, showing that even systematic cruelty had to work around practical realities of pre-industrial life, where everyone's survival ultimately depended on successful harvests. The childhood games and education that young Vlad experienced before becoming hostage are completely unrecorded, which is unfortunate because understanding his early formation might illuminate how a person develops into someone capable of industrial-scale impalement. Did he play typical medieval children's games? Was he trained in weapons from early age, as noble children typically were? What stories was he told about power, justice, and proper conduct for princes? His father, Vlad II Drakel, was himself a complex political operator who made difficult choices to maintain power. So young Vlad probably received education in pragmatic realpolitik rather than idealistic governance. The Order of the Dragon that his father belonged to was dedicated to fighting Ottoman expansion. So the household culture probably emphasized military resistance to Islam and the defense of Christianity, creating ideological foundations that Vlad would later express through extreme methods. But the gap between normal medieval noble education and becoming someone who creates forests of impaled corpses remains difficult to bridge without more information about his psychological development during those missing years. The water management systems in Vlad's territories were crucial infrastructure that affected everything from agriculture to military campaigns. Yet they're rarely discussed in chronicles that focus on battles and politics. Wells, springs, rivers, and irrigation systems supplied water for drinking, cooking, agriculture, and livestock, making them strategic military targets during campaigns. Vlad's poisoning of water sources during his scorched earth retreat was devastating because medieval people couldn't easily purify water or transport over long distances, meaning contaminated water sources could deny territory to advancing armies and force them to retreat or face disease and death from waterborne illness. The public fountain where Vlad allegedly left a golden cup that nobody dared steal was part of urban water infrastructure, providing communal access to clean water while serving as gathering place for social interaction and information exchange. Control of water was control of life, which is why rulers invested in maintaining water systems even during warfare, except when they were deliberately destroying them to deny resources to enemies, creating conditions where civilian populations suffered regardless of who won the military campaigns. The relationship between Vlad and his younger brother Radu the Handsome, after they were separated as child hostages and ended up on opposite sides of the Ottoman-Wallachian conflict, adds soap opera drama to an already complicated story. Radu apparently thrived in Ottoman captivity, possibly becoming the lover of Mehmed II, according to sources that hint heavily, without stating explicitly, converted to Islam, and eventually led Ottoman forces against his own brother for control of Wallachia. Family reunions must have been incredibly awkward if they ever occurred, which they probably didn't, because meeting your brother who's trying to overthrow you with a foreign army isn't typically conducive to warm reminiscences about childhood. Did they communicate during their conflict? Did Radu try to convince Vlad to surrender or negotiate? Did Vlad view his brother as a traitor or simply as someone who made different survival choices during their shared captivity? We don't know because the sources focus on military operations rather than family dynamics. But the psychological reality of fighting your brother in a civil war backed by the empire that held you both hostage must have been complex for everyone involved. The propaganda value of Vlad's cruelty to various political actors reveals how the same actions could be interpreted completely differently depending on the observer's interests. To Mehmed II and the Ottomans, Vlad was a dangerous fanatic whose extreme violence demonstrated Christian barbarism and justified Ottoman civilizing missions. To Hungarian rulers, he was sometimes a useful buffer against Ottoman expansion and sometimes an embarrassing ally whose methods made supporting him politically difficult. To the Pope and Western Christians, he was either a defender of the faith or a liability, depending on whether they needed to rally support for crusades or justify their own failure to aid Eastern Christians. To German merchants and Saxon communities in Transylvania, he was a tyrant who threatened their economic interests and violated their privileges. To Romanian peasants, he was possibly a harsh but fair ruler or a terrifying monster, depending on their personal experiences. Everyone instrumentalized Vlad's violence for their own purposes, which is why his historical reputation is so contradictory. He was whatever people needed him to be in their particular political narratives. The astronomical and calendrical knowledge available to Vlad and his court affected military planning more than typically acknowledged because pre-modern warfare depended on natural light cycles, seasonal weather patterns, and the agricultural calendar in ways that industrialized militaries don't. The night attack in June 1462 was timed for a period of short summer nights, maximizing the confusion and psychological impact of attacking in darkness while minimizing the time available for Ottoman forces to organize defense before dawn. Scheduling executions, military campaigns, and diplomatic missions all required understanding calendar systems that were more complex in medieval Europe than modern standardized calendars, with religious festivals, saints' days, and local variations affecting when certain activities were appropriate or auspicious. Easter Sunday was chosen for the Boyar Massacre not randomly, but because it was a major religious festival when nobles would expect celebration rather than arrest, showing Vlad understood the symbolic impact of timing. Medieval people lived much more closely attuned to natural cycles than modern urbanized populations, and military leaders who ignored these cycles did so at their peril. The currency exchange and trade relationships between Wallachia and neighboring economies created financial networks that continued functioning even during military conflicts because medieval economics separated commercial transactions from political hostilities more than modern sanction regimes allow. Merchants needed to exchange Wallachian currency for Hungarian, Polish, Ottoman, or Venetian money to conduct cross-border trade, requiring money changers and exchange rate calculations that created opportunities for fraud that Vlad allegedly punished with impalement. The annual tribute of 10,000 ducats that Wallachia owed the Ottoman Empire represented a massive economic drain that required extracting surplus from the agricultural economy, converting it to currency, and transferring it to Ottoman authorities, essentially taxation flowing upward to imperial centers. Vlad's refusal to pay this tribute was economically significant beyond the symbolic rejection of Ottoman authority. representing resources that could be redirected to military spending or kept in Wallachia rather than enriching Istanbul. The economic dimensions of his conflicts rarely get emphasized in chronicles that focus on battles and impalement, but follow the money and you'll understand why various actors took the positions they did. The sleep patterns and daily routines of Vlad are completely unknown, which might seem trivial, but actually matters for understanding how someone manages to govern a principality while conducting military campaigns and overseeing mass executions. Medieval people generally slept in two phases separated by a waking period in the middle of the night, a pattern completely foreign to modern industrial sleep schedules. Did Vlad follow this pattern? Was he an insomniac traumatized by his past? Did he sleep soundly despite ordering atrocities daily? The night attack suggests he was comfortable operating in darkness and could function during nocturnal hours, but whether that was exceptional or routine, we don't know. Medieval rulers had to balance governing with military command, diplomatic correspondence, and personal life, requiring organizational skills and time management that must have been challenging given the lack of artificial lighting and communication technologies that modern leaders take for granted. Somehow Vlad found time to plan campaigns, conduct diplomacy, govern domestic affairs, and personally lead military operations, suggesting either remarkable efficiency or chronic sleep deprivation, possibly both. The role of horses in Vlad's military operations and daily life was absolutely central in ways that modern people who don't depend on animal transportation struggle to appreciate. Medieval cavalry required enormous investments in breeding, training, feeding, and maintaining horses that were simultaneously military assets, transportation infrastructure, and status symbols. Vlad's night raids depended on mounted forces that could move quickly, attack suddenly, and retreat before organized resistance formed, requiring horses trained for combat and riders skilled in mounted warfare. The scorched earth retreat that destroyed agricultural resources would have also targeted fodder and pastures needed for enemy cavalry, since armies without horses lost mobility and striking power. The logistics of maintaining hundreds or thousands of war horses during campaign season required sophisticated supply networks and veterinary knowledge that had to function even while humans were being impaled and territory devastated. Medieval warfare was fundamentally equestrian, and understanding military history requires understanding horse culture, breeding, training, and care that supported cavalry operations. The disease environment in medieval Wallachia affected everything from infant mortality to military campaigns, creating a baseline of suffering and death that made the violence of warfare and execution seem less exceptional than it appears to modern audiences who've largely eliminated epidemic disease through public health measures. Bubonic plague periodically swept through Europe, including the Balkans, killing large percentages of populations in waves that disrupted economies and societies for generations. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and other infectious diseases were endemic, creating constant background mortality that medieval people accepted as normal. In this context, dying from impalement was horrible, but not categorically different from dying slowly from disease, which probably helped normalize Vlad's methods in ways that seem incomprehensible to modern audiences who expect to live into their 70s or 80s rather than dying in childhood or early adulthood, as was common in medieval times. The Ottoman army's retreat from Wallachia was influenced by disease spreading through their camp as much as by psychological horror at the forest of the impaled, showing that microbes were often more decisive in medieval warfare than weapons or tactics. The oral traditions and storytelling practices in Vlad's court and throughout Wallachia would have shaped how his actions were understood and transmitted to future generations. But we've lost most of this oral culture because it wasn't written down until centuries later when it had been transformed by subsequent events and cultural changes. Bards, minstrels, and traveling entertainers would have created songs and stories about Vlad's campaigns, victories, and cruelties, circulating these narratives throughout Romania and neighboring regions long before printed pamphlets reached Western Europe. These oral traditions would have emphasized different aspects than written chronicles, possibly focusing on heroic resistance, clever stratagems, or moral lessons rather than just documenting events. The fact that Vlad remained prominent in Romanian folk memory, while many other medieval rulers were forgotten, suggests his story had narrative power that transcended historical accuracy, providing plots and characters that storytellers could adapt for different purposes and audiences over centuries. The Vlad of folk tradition and the Vlad of historical record diverged early and continued separating until they became almost different people. The impact of Vlad's reign on gender relations and women's lives in Wallachia can only be speculated about based on general medieval patterns and scattered references in chronicles, because women's experiences rarely generated historical documentation unless they were queens or saints. The massacre of boyar families at Easter included women and children, and the forced labor at Poenry Castle worked women to death alongside men, suggesting Vlad didn't discriminate based on gender when it came to collective punishment. The legend of his first wife's suicide might reflect that being married to Vlad was genuinely terrifying even for someone in his inner circle, though this story might also be invention designed to add tragedy to his legend. Women in medieval Wallachia generally had limited legal rights, few economic opportunities outside household production or religious life, and were subject to male authority in families and society. Whether Vlad's reign made things worse for women specifically, or just continued baseline medieval patriarchy with added terror affecting everyone regardless of gender, is impossible to determine without better sources. But the general devastation of constant warfare, mass execution, and economic disruption would have been gendered in ways that affected women's lives differently from men's, even if chronicles didn't record these differences.